It's really inspiring to see so many people who remain committed to this fight, and we're looking forward to a very generative evening of conversation. Thanks so much to my partners in Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education, and especially Shannon Clark, Jill Penn, Julia Paré, and Jennifer Middlestadt, who have been particularly instrumental in tonight's program. And thanks to our co-sponsors, United Campus Workers of Georgia and HALU. Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education is an organization of scholars who are committed to holistically analyzing the current crisis in higher education and charting a path towards a better future. We see our current predicament as a multifaceted crisis that has many historical roots. It's a crisis of funding, both the diminished government funding for higher ed and the escalating student debt. It's a crisis of governance, with boards of trustees and state legislatures increasingly dictating what happens on campuses. It's a crisis of labor, particularly with the increase in the precarity of our workforce. It's a crisis of legitimacy. The very mission of the university is being challenged, particularly with the growing public mistrust of expertise. And it's a crisis of speech, seen in things like the repression of pro-Palestinian voices and the attacks on teaching about race and gender. Since 2020, Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education has been drawing connections between these threats and charting a robust vision for a path forward. And tonight, we have 6 amazing speakers representing different pieces of this work. Karma Chavez is from the University of Texas, Austin, AAUP. Isaac Kamola from the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. Rotua Lumbantobing from the National AAUP. Mia McIver from Higher Education Labor United. Nikil Saval, who's a Pennsylvania State Senator. And Colena Sesanker from the Connecticut Board of Regents for Higher Ed. And at the end, we'll open this up for audience comments and Q&A. Before we begin, Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education is a scrappy organization. Our only source of funding is donations. To continue to put on forums like this and to hold what we're envisioning as a spring summit on the future of higher education, we need your support, both in terms of money and also if you have energy and time to give. We'll be dropping links in the chat with ways to support our work. So now to begin, I want to invite Isaac onto the Zoom stage. And let me see if I can do that. Okay. So Isaac, one of the things we're facing is the growth of conservative attacks on higher ed, and you've been monitoring this for years now. From your perspective, how will these attacks amplify and perhaps change during the next 4 years? And how do you want us to prepare to fight?
Great. That's a great question. Elisa, thanks for hosting this event. The Scholars for a New Deal in Higher Education is such an important organization, creating a positive vision, a sweeping, affirmative vision of what higher education is and can be. In order to answer this question, I think it's really important to kind of put it in a historical context and to start not with a romantic view of higher education, where we start with this narrative of there was a great public university and this great higher education system that over the years has been structurally adjusted and neoliberalized and then is now being attacked by all directions. And what we need to do is go back to this golden age. Instead, I think it's important to remember that the history of higher education is always, for as long as higher education has been around, has been about reproducing racial and gendered hierarchies, and that there is the one kind of exceptional period where this hierarchical notion of higher education was fundamentally and radically challenged was during the middle of the 20th century, where you have massive social movements, the anti-war, the free speech, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the queer movement, pushing against all social institutions, including higher education, and demanding a more just and equitable society. And as a result of those massive movements, universities, like other social institutions, began, not finished, but began the process of democratization in a real radical and profound way. And when that happened, you begin to have new people in higher education, in higher education spaces, no longer white men who are interested in studying the classical canon, but instead a lot of people who are asking, why isn't my reality represented? And so then the history of the backlash that we are experiencing now is not a history of the last year or 2 years or 5 years, but is a longer history of backlash to this radical social transformation that you can pit with the massive resistance to integration and Brown v. Board, to the anti-tax a reaction in the 1980s, which was the recreation of the massive resistance, but now in the language of economics, as Nancy McLean, who's on this call, knows better than anybody and has done amazing work to demonstrate that. And so in order to think of the last few years and what we're facing now, within this broader context, I think it's helpful to split it up into three kind of distinct phases. The first one that I would call like pre-Black Lives Matter, the pre-2020 massive protests, is the campus free speech crisis, which I cover in my book, Free Speech and Coke Money with Ralph Wilson, where we look at a bunch of dark money organizations that are funding the manufacturing of this narrative that says there's a crisis of speech in higher education, that higher education is pushing political correctness, is pushing, they didn't use the term woke then, they used all these other terms like political correctness, and that there's something that higher education was hostile to conservative speech. And then following the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, the massive mega donors and the right wing in general start to freak out about, again, this massive social protest that's taking place. And activists like Christopher Rufo, Ken Klingenstein at the Claremont Institute, and others very deliberately craft a narrative of anti-CRT, anti-divisive concepts, and eventually anti-DEI as a way to push back against what some people have called the third reconstruction, right? And now we're going to enter into this new phase, which we can call Trump 2.0, which is an extension and an intensification of the previous two phases. And I think what happens in those previous two phases is you get a distrust, just a kind of institutionalized, well-funded mechanism to sow distrust in academic institutions, to discredit the way that the academy produces knowledge, and to explicitly target Black scholars, scholars of color, women, and queer scholars. And we have identified this in the studies of targeted harassment, who are the faculty that are explicitly being targeted by this infrastructure, that infrastructure that then uses individual faculty as examples, turns things that they have said or distortions and manipulations of things that they have said and turn it into an anecdote, and then collect these series of anecdotes to then create a narrative about how higher education is hostile to higher education. So that kind of campus free speech a crisis, a language gets supercharged in 2020, and especially the 2021, 2022, and the last few legislative cycles where you get these anti-DEI, anti-CRT bills. And now what we're going to see is in Trump 2.0, the federalization of this well-funded strategy that has primarily been taking place at the state level. So what can we expect to see? I would say an expanded attacks on accreditation, and this could take two forms. In Florida, they have undermined the ability for schools to use the same accreditor each accreditation cycle and demand that institutions basically a credit shop, to weaken the ability of accreditation, to basically make it the legislators, political operatives, trustees, and donors have greater control over things like curriculum and what goes on college campuses, and institutions can't say, but we need to do this in order to get accreditation. So the weakening of the accreditation institution, but also the weaponization of accreditation against things like a DEI initiatives. We're also going to see the intensification of the use of Title VI, and especially tied with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, to kind of take this notion that any critique of the state of Israel is a criticism, is anti-Semitic. But there's also another variation where Title VI can also be used to go against DEI efforts in the name of discrimination, right? So these efforts discriminate against white people, use the DEI or the Title VI infrastructure to go after I heard somebody who was at an American Enterprise Institute event this week and heard them gleefully talking about this as a potential strategy. There's going to be efforts to directly interfere in the curriculum, as we've seen in Florida, where the Board of Governors is literally deciding which classes should be removed from the core curriculum outside of any forms of shared governance. And you're going to see the continued delegitimization of higher education, because as Chris Rufo says, universal delegitimization is the linchpin to universal voucherization. So attacking higher education is going to continue to be a Trojan horse by which these same malevolent actors can continue to attempt to privatize K-12, which we know is highly unpopular. But so I'm at my time, so I'll cede.
Thank you, Isaac. I want to turn now to Karma. And Karma, you're on the ground in Texas, where the right-wing attacks have been devastating. Can you give us a kind of top-line summary of what you're gearing up to face in the spring? Does what Isaac says about the challenges that we face, does that ring true in the case of Texas? And what might you add to his view?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I really appreciate everything that the Scholars for a New Deal are doing, and happy to be a part of this conversation. Yes, so I think one of the things we have to be very clear about is that the state of Texas is one of two primary templates for the federal government, with Florida being the other one. And what we're seeing in Texas, so briefly, in the 2023 legislative session, so Texas does every other year, 140-day leg sessions. So in 2023, what we saw was one, SB 17, which was banning all DEI in basically every form on public university campuses. And we also saw SB 18, which was a watering down of the meaning of tenure that created several new grounds for termination, including one's political activity that is embarrassing to the institution. And so there's also now a process for summary dismissal without due process. So those were the two things that passed in 2023. What didn't pass in 2023 was SB 16, which was a ban on so-called critical race theory. That was the one that we were able to defeat. So what are we looking at in 2025 as we head into the next session? Situation is pretty dire. There was interim meeting of the Higher Education Subcommittee of the Senate that happened in early November. And in that, the primary objective was to revisit how SB 17, the anti-DEI law, is working and what needs to be improved to make it more holistic. Well, what do they mean by that? SB 17 originally was designed to exclude teaching, research, and creative activity from its purview. In other words, it didn't impact academic freedom at all. And so we can still do all the same things we've always done in the classroom and in our research. We could talk about how that hasn't actually happened, but ostensibly, that's very clearly what the law says. But what's clear now is that Senator Brandon Creighton, who is the head of the Higher Education Committee, has said that the spirit of the law is meant to apply to these other things, particularly the curriculum. And so one of the things that we're sure is coming is a ban on all things related to race, gender, and sexuality in particular. So in the state of Texas, LGBT studies has become a target. In fact, at Texas A&M University, the other big public research university in the state, they actually removed preemptively their LGBT studies minor, saying that it didn't have enough enrollment, despite, as we all know, minors don't really cost anything at all, and it doesn't really matter how many people are in them because they're a part of other programs. So we imagine that that's going to be a primary target, but we're also very concerned about ethnic studies departments and programs, as well as gender studies departments and programs. Another thing that we're especially concerned about is the targeting of faculty governance. So the lieutenant governor, who is also the president of the Senate, has indicated that faculty councils are square in his sights. He thinks faculty governance is the way that we're allowed to indoctrinate our students with all this left-wing ideology. And so he wants to get rid of faculty councils and all semblance of faculty governance on Texas public universities. As Isaac mentioned, accreditation is also going to be a target for the Texas State Legislature. They want to find a way to get rid of accreditation, probably in many of the ways that Isaac has mentioned. Another thing that is likely to come up, and this is sort of tricky, is the question of core curriculum. So to give the example at UT Austin, we have what's called a flag system. In other words, students have to acquire a certain number of flags in order to complete their degree programs. These include things like cultural diversity, global cultures, independent inquiry, ethics, and quantitative reasoning. And so these can be assigned to different classes across all the different departments on campus, although they're squarely centered primarily in the College of Liberal Arts, which is, of course, where all the ethnic and gender studies departments are centered. And there is a big push to get rid of the flags system under the auspices of slowing time to graduation. And I'll say that our president at UT Austin has already indicated that he's probably going to be willing to sacrifice these requirements related to core curriculum in order to protect the academic freedom of faculty in teaching and research. The problem with that, though, is if all of our classes in my department, Mexican American and Latino Studies, become only elective and we no longer can be a part of the core curriculum, students will not have very much incentive to take our courses unless they're a major. Currently, I have about 55 majors and 120 minors. And so you can see the logic there, that getting rid of these kinds of core curriculum requirements in terms of legislation is going to lead to cutting funding and ultimately dismantling these departments as well. So things in Texas are pretty dire, but we're going to fight like hell. Thanks.
Thank you, Karma. And happy you're there fighting for us. We're now going to hear from Mia. Mia, the attacks we're seeing are also the results of the increasing embrace of business models in higher ed, which has resulted in the hollowing out of labor rights on our campuses. Can you tell us about HELU and how you see academic labor organizations' battles and roles over the next few years?
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to scholars for this very, very important convening, which I know is just the start here as we move closer to 2025. So Higher Education Labor United is a national coalition that brings together higher ed workers from different job categories, different institution types, and different international unions. And HELU includes student workers, professional staff, workers from university medical centers, service and maintenance workers, adjunct and contingent faculty, postdocs and other research workers, and tenure-line faculty from community colleges, state universities, and research institutions in both, and this is really important, both the public and the private sector. So about 150 unions representing more than 500,000 higher ed workers have endorsed HELU's vision platform. And HELU is funded through solidarity pledges from our member unions and from individual donors. And our organizing is focused in two main areas. The first is empowering higher ed workers to take political action. So assertive and proactive political action is necessary here to reclaim higher education as a public good. And this means pushing candidates and elected officials to have progressive higher ed policy platforms. It means demanding that labor justice be a precondition of educational equity. And it means, above all, fighting for public reinvestment in our colleges and universities to ensure their future as a common good. So we're developing model state and federal policies, and we're also building the capacity to get them passed and implemented. And as an example of that, I'll just share the Statement of Unity from earlier this summer and fall that brought together 11 national and international unions and labor organizations in unprecedented alignment around some of these policy priorities. So the second main area of HELU's organizing is coordinating in metro, regional, and statewide contexts to align bargaining priorities and issue-based campaigns. And so that includes, at the moment, tracking and fighting austerity claims that are used pretextually to shutter programs and campuses. That means offering solidarity and strategic support to higher ed workers who are at the forefront of these struggles. That includes identifying demands that can be pursued in common. Higher ed employers are very well organized, very highly coordinated, and we need to be also in order to bring the fight to them. The next 4 years are obviously going to present major challenges. Isaac and Karma have just scratched the surface about the attacks that we're going to be confronting. But what we're facing also means that we can pursue an expansive vision of higher ed as a public good without compromise. And I especially want to credit Becky Given from Rutgers AAUP AFT, who's HELU's chair of our Politics and Policy Committee, for really making this point very, very strongly. We can dream big, we can spread our wings, we can be as ambitious as possible. We don't have to move to the center, and we don't have to make concessions. And I think one thing that I really want to share with all of you this evening is that labor has to be in the vanguard of these struggles. Those of us who collectively bargain are used to exercising our voices, in our workplaces through our unions. And we have to loudly and publicly demand that same seat at the table when it comes to the future of higher ed, whether we have a union or not. And I think a lot of the conversations that I'm having with people across the country right now are really focused on independence from political interference, really focused on campus autonomy. Those are absolutely crucial, but they're also not enough. That independence and that autonomy, those are part of the solution. What we can't do is cede that independence and autonomy only to higher ed administrators and executive level management, because the administrators, the higher ed trade organizations that have moved to privatize higher education over the last 50 years cannot be trusted with that autonomy, cannot be, they're not going to save us. So we have to build militant struggles to take back that power that has been drained off from us as higher ed workers. In other words, that independence, that autonomy, that solidarity belongs to us as workers. It does not belong to the administrators who lead our campuses exclusively. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mia. Colena, you've been working in Connecticut, a blue state, where the embrace of business models has resulted in drastic cuts in public funding for higher ed. What do you see as the major challenges and goals in the coming months and years?
Thanks. So let me begin by giving a little bit of context, because Connecticut is a blue state. And this past November, our state legislature got even more blue. The composition of our House and Senate moved a little bit more towards the progressive end of things. But we have been suffering and continue to suffer cuts and threats of cuts to higher education, to state services generally. And the kinds of threats that we see here, we see across the country. So much like Isaac mentioned, that some of the models are, it's Texas and Florida. For us, we see the things that are happening in Connecticut also happening in places like California and New York, and the similarities are really striking. So there's a sort of a national trend that moves us in this direction. So even at this moment, even though we have a budget, like we have a rainy day fund, a budget surplus of $4.5 billion, and we have siphoned off about $9 billion worth of revenue over the past 7 years to just prepay, debts, as opposed to investing in our population at a time where we were dealing with a pandemic, where we are suffering great understaffing, et cetera. Right now, the governor, even with all of that revenue available to us, has imposed mid-year cuts on higher education and all other state agencies. So very much the state of higher education for us is simply just a byproduct of an attitude towards state spending and budget restrictions that leaves us in a position where we are in sort of existential risk, even though nobody really gives a damn what we do there, right? So just this morning, I attended a presentation at the Board of Regents from a national higher education consultant commissioned by the governor that aims to figure out how to reduce investment in the system even more. And for the past 15 years, funding has been lagging way behind inflation. And the whole state budget, though, is prevented from growing to a point where it could fund us adequately by this weird combination of policies that ties the hands of future legislators and governors for up to 10 years, right? And removing those restrictions would require a vote of 3/5 of the legislature and the governor's signature. So what we're facing in higher ed, just like bare minimum getting by, requires addressing state budget restrictions that have the force of a constitutional amendment. The only extra money we've seen in the last 7 years has come in the form of one-time funding, and you can imagine what that has done to our staffing. You cannot hire permanent staff on one-time money, so our workforce is increasingly contingent and precarious, and tuition is on the rise. So the report today recommending structural changes to accommodate what seems to be this inevitable decline of funding is not the first or second project of its kind. In the last 15 years, public higher education in Connecticut has undergone 2 major restructures, both with the aim of reducing cost, both resulting in serious and expensive dysfunction. Interestingly for us, many of these really devastating restructures, these things that exacerbate this sort of history of the effects of higher education to sort of seal in place hierarchies of race and class, has been justified or marketed with the rhetoric of equity and DEI, et cetera, even though it does exactly the opposite, right? So it is packaged in this way where we don't always recognize it for what it is. So looking forward right now, I see 3 major things that I think we'll be wrestling with in the next few months. First of all, this national trend, is really about dealing with all of our states are trying to reduce state spending, and higher ed is the biggest pot usually of discretionary spending, so always on the line. While we can talk about DEI in our state at the level of actual material conditions, at the level of funding and structure, we don't have the tools to pursue equity, and in fact continue to exacerbate the existing discrepancies, right? The inequities we have racial and class inequities in our very wealthy state that remain unaddressed. So with the threats to federal funding, we need more than ever to address those fiscal straitjackets I talked about that make it impossible for us to raise more revenue or to spend the revenue that we have to fill in any gaps left by the federal government to our system and to state services generally. It has required a statewide coalition of unions, faith groups, community groups, et cetera, to educate the public and to take real public action to move in the direction of getting the kind of response from the legislature that we will need. Second, we are looking at, we're very lucky in our state that our legislature, attorney general, governor, all very invested in making sure they would keep in place any labor protections that we have at the state level that would protect against anything happening at the national level. But we have to be very careful that it's written in the right way and that it covers both private and higher education employees. So we're looking at that. And then the other is just thinking about, because of the way that this is going, there is no one to really advocate. Yes, I sit on the board, but as an elected faculty representative and non-voting. And we need to think about new structure and compositions of our boards of regents so that they represent and are accountable to the populations they serve rather than a single individual. In our state, it's just the governor. Whatever the governor wants goes. He appoints the majority of our board. And think about new structures for governance that don't create this permanent managerial class that is also not accountable to us, but to the governor and the board, et cetera, right? So that's where I think we are at the moment and what we will be focusing on for the next several months.
Thanks, Colena. Senator Saval, you've been just such a wonderful ally to those of us advocating for higher ed. Wondering, what does all this look like from the State House perspective? How have you seen higher ed treated? What do you think we should expect at the state or national level? And from your perspective, like really, like what is most important for us to do right now?
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really grateful to be part of this important conversation and this exceptional set of presentations. It's very inspiring and sobering at the same time for me. So, you know, just to kind of ground us in the world that we are all fighting for, government, state government should be an entity that invests heavily in its institutions of higher education, obviously via funding, but also through supportive policies, legislation, and deep sort of collaboration on community needs. This is not the world that we live in now, and I really appreciate the effort of so many people to push back on these tides. So of course, I come to this conversation right now as a Pennsylvania legislator whose work includes oversight, among other things, of the Pennsylvania state system of higher education, also considerable work and funding with regards to Penn State, Lincoln, Temple University, and the University of Pittsburgh. And then some involvement one way or the other of the state in many, many private institutions as well. But I'm also someone who has spent a number of years in academia and publishing and sort of institutions connected to academia as a student, a teacher, a researcher, and a writer. And of course, as a parent and community member, I know the vital role that our higher education institutions hold in important advances in arts, sciences, humanities, technology, and that their health and well-being is as important as ever. The realities, of course, as we've been hearing from our partners in various states and nationally on this call and more generally, is that these crucial institutions are in crisis. I would say that in Pennsylvania, and it's not unique to Pennsylvania, and in the Pennsylvania legislature, there is a broad consensus, not necessarily one that I share in its analysis, but one that the crisis is fundamentally a demographic crisis. That we have falling enrollments due to shifting demographics, whether with regards to the population in Pennsylvania, not necessarily keeping pace with previous, an aging population, and that our institutions need to be restructured accordingly. I would say that there is also broadly in the state legislature and in government a neoliberal perspective on this. There's, of course, in Pennsylvania, because we have divided government, a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, a Democratic governor, I'd say narrow agreement on the political right in particular that lays blame on progressive values upheld by professors, action by students. This isn't exclusively the domain of the right. This rhetoric, as we know, is intensified under Democratic administrations nationally and Democratic city administrations. And we should expect this to intensify further in the years ahead. And the reality, in my perspective, is that this crisis is political and this crisis is manufactured. I've witnessed, for example, our Commonwealth's structural disinvestment over the last 4 years, the years that I've served as a state senator, through the consolidation and closing of public universities that are part of the Pennsylvania system of higher education, otherwise known as the PASHE system. I would say that Pennsylvania higher education is headed into a very uncertain period. We've continued to see structural disinvestment in public higher education. Our last budget this year passed with the growth of the institution of a task force that is meant to explore the issues that higher education is facing. And there are a range of questions that we should expect from this task force. One part of it is a consideration of performance-based funding for our higher education institutions, which I believe is a dangerous, punitive, neoliberal approach. These initiatives are suffocating our public education systems, but they are also present, to be clear, in the private sector, where often public officials can be surprised or have little control over what happens. We saw the consequences of this firsthand this past spring with the abrupt closure of the University of the Arts, which is a major institution supported students, workers, and artists throughout our region. The constriction of resources is also a trend nationally, and of course will be exacerbated under a Trump presidency that will be much more hostile, as we know from the kind of template states, as Professor Chavez mentioned, hostile to colleges and universities, throwing up smoke screens of campus politics as in part justification to continue the course of disinvestment in these institutions. At the state level, and certainly in Pennsylvania, collective forces have not yet coalesced to fight back against the tightening grip that these institutions are under. But there is space for it. And I think to push back, we need to see a concerted effort. I likewise uphold what Mia said, that the energy that we're seeing in labor organizing on campuses by faculty and staff, by graduate student workers and researchers, even by RAs, is incredibly inspiring. We need much, much more of this. There is a new coalition of labor action that is taking place at the University of Pennsylvania, representing multiple unions. The graduate workers at the University of Temple University won a nationally sort of watched fight for their contract. We need more, not just in terms of the labor organizing of the workers, but also especially that, but also in terms of the systems of governments inside colleges and universities. And then also crucially outside. It matters, and it should matter that we have pro-education legislators who understand what is actually driving the crisis in higher education. So for example, the investigation as to what precipitated the closure of the University of the Arts is still ongoing. It's actually ongoing, under the auspices in part of the Attorney General. But this past summer, in the wake of its closure, I worked closely with colleagues of mine, Representatives Ben Waxman and Bob Mursky, to create a mechanism for new regulations to protect our universities and the communities that depend on them. We pushed for the inclusion of language in the state budget to require the Pennsylvania Department of Education to put in place procedures that guarantee orderly closures, including a teach-out plan for students, along with the preservation and accessibility of student and administrative records, and proper notifications and compensation to workers. Schools that don't meet those requirements wouldn't get state funding, which most private colleges receive despite not being public institutions. So if we had more pro-education legislators, we wouldn't see the introduction and passage of legislation like legislation to institute, say, performance-based budgeting that only strangles it further. I think it's also no surprise to this group that I believe that organizing is, or to hear rather, that organizing is what it will take truly to turn the tide. I think our work is to create strategy for this organizing on campus, in the legislature, and also in surrounding communities. Higher education institutions really anchor communities, and this is true in rural areas and of course in dense urban areas like Philadelphia. And we need the engagement of communities to fortify these efforts. So I'm excited to do that work under extremely challenging conditions in the years to come. So thank you.
Thanks so much. We're going to end with Rotua. Rotua, many of us have been so heartened to see the national AAUP get a new slate of leaders like you who are committed to broadening the mandate of the organization. And I'm wondering what you make of the perspectives shared here tonight and what the AAUP's plans are for the years ahead.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for this opportunity. So I want to back up a little bit. So the reform slate, the United Faculty for the Common Good, actually started 2 years ago when we won 4 seats on the AAUP National Council. Then earlier this year, Todd, Daniel, Chenjerai, and I won the 3 executive officer positions and 1 more council seat, which means the progressives are now in control of AAUP leadership. We ran on a vision of transforming AAUP into a fighting union, and historically it has not been the case. And we want AAUP as the only union that is exclusively composed of higher ed workers to lead the sector, and working with AFT, SEIU, UAW, and other unions of academic labor. So we focus on 3 things. First, we need to build labor power to fight against anti-democratic boards of trustees and university presidents. To do that, we have to engage members and empower them through organizing. Second, we need to build solidarity across job categories on every campus and support each other to push against corporatization of higher ed. Last, but definitely not least, we must build alliances with our students, community groups, faith-based organizations, and the rest of the public to restore the mission of higher education as a common good. Now, obviously, the incoming Trump administration complicates this focus. And as Isaac and Karma discussed, the threats on labor and the higher ed sector are immense, from eliminating the Department of Education to federal interference on accreditation to eliminating the DI efforts to banning free speech, on and on and on. So we understand this and we're preparing to respond and when possible, get ahead of these attacks. We recently formed a rapid response team to develop short-term, but also long-term strategies to defend the higher ed sector. For example, we're putting together a list of resources for faculty to respond to harassment, targeting, and any other attacks, and to educate each other and students on these threats and the overall political landscape. And we are reaching out to our allies, and we're working with our allies at national level and state level. So this includes AUP state conferences and AFT state federations, and also HILU and national unions, as Mia discussed earlier. So I need to mention that we can do more in some states. We saw progressives won in state legislative races in Connecticut, including an AUP member who is a law professor at Quinnipiac University. So we're very excited about that. But as Colena said, we still face severe budget cuts. So we must expand the political bench, work with our allies to identify leaders who can step up and represent labor interests. Most important though, we must engage members and build solidarity. This work is crucial, regardless of who's in the White House. We cannot mobilize if we are not organized. To that end, AUP, in collaboration with Bargaining for the Common Good and Berkeley Labor Center, held a Skills to Win organizing training last month. More than 200 attended, including some members from other unions. And we want to keep this going, of course. We plan to hold another training in the spring and trainings on more specific issues such as bargaining, racial justice, and how to win without collective bargaining. So to close, the challenges are enormous, but they also create possibilities to work with other unions and like-minded groups, and to engage the public and build power. The work is obviously, as we all have recognized, is very hard, but to us, this is not just about higher ed or about labor. This is a social movement, and we are ready to fight. Because when we fight, we win. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rotua. And we're going to spotlight all the speakers at this point as we open this up for questions and answers. I'm hearing one of the things that I'm hearing for sure is that this is a manufactured crisis, and therefore, as academics, some of what we like to do is, present the best arguments, right? The facts and the research or whatever, and that it's not going to work because the crisis is actually a manufactured one, and that one of the strategy that everyone seems to be coming back to is organizing, right? And in various kinds of ways. So I'd like to, at this point, open it up to questions. If you can use the raise hand feature, that would be great. And I know, Jennifer Klein, you have a great question. And if you're there and you can unmute yourself and start us off, that would be wonderful. And if not, I'll ask it for you. But if you're here, Jennifer, please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask how you see those of us in private universities as being allies with this fight. I mean, obviously this is going to come to us at some point, but, I'm in a university with tremendous resources, and yet it's clear that our administration is not going to step out in front and defend either higher ed or the types of classes that are taught in the humanities and the social sciences. So, definitely this stuff is going to come to us, even though our administrations seem to think like we're insulated from it. But what do you see as like the best role of allies in private universities working with people in public universities?
Jump in, speakers.
Well, I think we need to fight shoulder to shoulder in all of these efforts, and I think the coalition that people are working on at Penn is just a magnificent example of this. I think it's really important that to recognize that private universities receive significant public funding, both through mechanisms such as the NIH, right, enormous amounts of grant funding, but also through Pell Grants, right, and those are streams of public funding that are very severely threatened right now. And so while the governance models and while the endowments can be different, more and more public and private institutions are functioning in similar ways, and there's a ton of potential for solidarity in these struggles.
I would just jump in real quick, Lisa.
Yeah,
which
we have
is
a
to
few
say,
people to jump in, so that's great.
I just want to say when I spoke with colleagues at Rice University in Texas, one of the things I charged them with is to use their resources to create infrastructures to host the kinds of events that we can't host at public universities, particularly around DEI. And so that could look any number of ways, but I do think being a venue for the kinds of conversations we can't have is one real good way to express your allyship.
And if I could just say quickly, I mean, I think one of the things we're concerned about is because the med school receives so much public money, is that like the humanities becomes like the blackmail that, basically public officials can say, well, if you want to hold on to all that med school funding, here's what we want to see, happen in terms of the humanities curriculum or the social science curriculum. So we also need to make sure we don't get like sucked into this blackmail. And the second thing I'll just say really quickly is when I asked our new president about surveillance, and we were told, well, we monitor all forms of social media, which is, we just have to do that. I mean, that's what every Fortune 500 company does. So like that has clearly become like our comparator.
Senator, did you have, yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I wanted to echo the fact that obviously there's just tremendous amounts of public dollars that go to private institutions, and so for example, there was actually, I'll just mention a bill that went through at least one chamber in the state legislature that would have threatened to cut off state funding to any university that divested from Israel. And so this was a bill that went through the Pennsylvania Senate with bipartisan support. And so that, that actually has sort of anticipates without this was several months before, the general election, anticipates some of the stuff that we might see, and that from the federal administration and probably many other states as well. And then I would just, be clear that that affects universities across the board, right? It obviously has, major implications for universities that largely rely on state funding, but it's a repressive measure one way or the other. So that I think requires things like that, of which there will be many such things, require all of us. Then there's also the function of the fact, I mean, it obviously differs, based on universities, of university closures, which I think has major impacts on the kinds of things that we're fighting for across the board. I mean, the University of the Arts, which closed, had an incredible labor organizing campaign that was an inspiration to many other people, only to then see the university shut down all of a sudden, right? And that, so there are institutions that are consolidating, that are closing, to the extent that we have, what happened at UArts is, maybe kind of in its way sui generis. We still, because it seems on the face of it to be so crazy as to maybe there's something we don't know about, but just there are so many other institutions that close in a quote unquote more orderly fashion, but nonetheless are catastrophes, in their way. And so to the extent that we can push for the things that prevent situations like that, that has effects on the lives of faculty and the ability for people to advocate and teach and reproduce culture, the arts, the sciences. Like we lose a university, you lose a lot. And I think, I think there's going to be, with the attacks on funding and sources of funding and things like that, and the already, kind of brewing political crisis of many of these institutions, we may see a wave of such closures as well. And so I think we need to be prepared to fight against that.
Thank you. All right, I see a question from Jeff Gore. Please unmute yourself and share.
Hello. Hi. You hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, so I'm in Chicago at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I am the vice president for the common good of our union, and we have in our last bargaining cycle, we had some initial success in bargaining beyond what we would have normally considered our working conditions, certainly beyond our pay, looking at issues of student mental health resources and bargaining for those. And this helped to create a sense of solidarity on our campus between faculty and students. And also because we have a commuter campus, it kind of created a greater sense within Chicago of faculty support of students there. But what really interests me, in part because we are a university that, by some accounts, we have the highest number of Pell eligible students among Research One universities. And what I'm interested in is that second level of, so we feel like we've conceptualized common good within our community, but like, what is it, like, what are some steps? So Molly McIver was talking about this initially, but everybody's in some ways addressing it, like some steps that you can take. Like, we feel as if we are at a place where we have gained a little bit of traction with what we do in our community and looking to move that to that next step of education. It's not just the common good between the faculty and the students, but education itself as a common good. And I'm wondering if maybe Maya McIver or others might have some suggestions about stepping stones towards that bigger conception of what education actually is.
Yeah, I love that question, Jeff, because the most effective labor organizing that I have witnessed, in the past 20 years or so, is led by people who are community organizers who are very deeply embedded in just really solid, durable, broad relationships, not only within their unions, but within their entire communities and their entire regions. And I think it's tough to have this conversation. It's a little tough without it kind of devolving into just a question of social mobility or campuses being an economic engine in their communities. I mean, those are undeniable aspects, but I think the question isn't reducible to those purely economic aspects, right? Nevertheless, I think that the way that higher education anchors communities is incredibly important in our strategizing. And it's something that we can learn a lot from K-12 organizing about, right? And we can learn to strategize, to situate ourselves, to narrativize ourselves, and to organize side by side with other community organizations and other community organizers to make the connections between healthcare and higher ed, between hospitality and higher ed, between skilled trades and higher ed, right? That our campuses are crossroads where all of those things meet and come together, and we can really leverage all of that.
I'll just jump in here if it's okay. This is one of the conversations that we have a lot at the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom among the fellows, and kind of this notion that the AAUP's kind of argument about academic freedom and institutional autonomy coming out of a certain notion of higher education is good for the common good, but that coming out of a progressive era and out of a time in which who was in the university was a very limited subset of the population, and what the common good meant was very delimited. So trying to think about how to make the argument about the common good in as expansive a way as possible. And I think that reframing education, not in terms of deficit, like academic freedom or an education or learning is something that is, a rare good that needs to be defended, but instead talk about it in capacious ways. I was at an event where somebody talks about, instead of defending tenure as this kind of rare commodity, we should instead make the argument that every profession should have intellectual freedom in the workplace, that's a value that all professions that we should aspire to, right? And so like kind of ways of thinking about de-exceptionalizing the university, I think is one way. Like there's a tendency to kind of think about the university as a special space, and it does things that no other parts of society do, but all parts of society have things that no other parts of society do. So kind of de-exceptionalizing the university is kind of an important way of kind of universalizing our struggles in solidarity with others.
Thank you. We're going to have time just for one more question. And then, as we said, this is just the prelude to a larger conversation. So Tamina Khan, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the conversation, and I love how we are bringing forward like an expansive vision of what higher education can and should be. I'm thinking, so I'm in San Francisco. I teach at UC Berkeley as well as City College of San Francisco, and we've been experiencing like rounds and rounds of austerity in both places. In different ways, but I'm thinking about how can we leverage our intellectual expertise across disciplines, because collectively we are smarter than any of the people trying to put us down. So that's just kind of a general and open question. Like we have engineers and writers and historians and everybody, right?
Let me just start quickly. I wish there's, I think Lisa mentioned this earlier probably, that I wish if we could just explain the problem to them, that they would just, tell us, oh, I'm sorry, right? But this is about power, right? We don't have power right now because we're not together. But as you said, we're not talking to each other, and we do have the expertise. And once in a while, we do use this expertise, this collective expertise, to mobilize. I think what we need now is to use that to organize, so we can do it in long term and sustained effort. So for example, I think during early in the pandemic, that faculty at several private universities, in fact, because of the administration's wanted to impose budget cuts, severe budget cuts, and faculty at these universities, they said, oh, no, and they did their own research and figured out, hey, they lied to us. So, once in a while we see this opportunity, right? This when faculty rose up, but we need to have it in a more sustained way. And we need to build solidarity also. And this is why we need to be talking to each other a lot more. And I would say this kind of forum is sorely needed.
Anyone else want a last comment? Thank you for that, Rotua. Well, it's a great way to end. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. As we said, we're hoping to have more of these conversations. Unfortunately, they are increasingly necessary, but also we gain strength from being together and from being in conversation. So we hope you have a wonderful holiday and we look forward. Thank you so much to Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education and to our amazing speakers. And you'll expect to hear from us. If you're not on our mailing list, please sign up and you can get more notice of these events run by all the people here and run by us. And we'll stay in touch, we'll stay in communication, and we'll keep the struggle going. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.